Hello, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Network 2020's webinar on Is America in Decline? My name is Courtney Doggart, and I'm the president of Network 2020. We are really pleased to have just a phenomenal panel today to debate this very important question. Before we begin, I just wanted to say a few words about Network 2020 for those of you who might be joining us for the first time. So we are an inclusive international community, and we really focus on bridging the gap between the private sector and the foreign policy community. And we try through our work in our network of entrepreneurial, established, and emerging leaders to highlight and drive innovative solutions to foreign policy challenges. And so we do a number of different programs, among them these webinars, but we also run discussion groups and a deep dive program on China, and we're doing original research in Tunisia, and we're implementing programs for the State Department. So we do a whole range of things. Please do check out our website and follow us on all social media. We are trying to reach 1,000 subscribers on our YouTube channel by the end of the year, so we would appreciate your help in doing that as well. It really is an honor today to introduce our two panelists and our moderator. This, I think, is a very critically important discussion that we need to have, and I can't think of two better people to help us have it. So we have Professor Paul Kennedy, and he is the J. Richardson Dilworth Professor of History and the Director of International Security Studies at Yale. He really is best known for, he's written many, many books, but one of the ones that's most relevant today and continues to spark great discussion is The Rise and Fall of Great Powers. And so he has a very long, distinguished background, as you can see, and we're so pleased to have him with us today. We also have Dr. Mathews. She is a Distinguished Fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and prior to that, she served as its president for 18 years. She has, again, just like Professor Kennedy, an extraordinary background in the foreign policy world. And one of the reasons why I wanted to reach out to her was an excellent article that she had in Foreign Affairs magazine a few issues back that really looked at, I think, pretty critically, the U.S. role in the world in ways that we can improve. So it was an excellent article. So welcome, both of you. It's such an honor to have you. And we're also pleased to have Dr. Joanna Waszewski moderating our conversation today. So with that, I will turn it over to you, Joanna.
Right. Thank you so much, Courtney, and welcome, panelists. The theory that America's geopolitical position has been declining in recent years has led to much debate in foreign policy circles. Is that decline based on perception or reality? Do America's adversaries, such as China and Russia, take advantage of that perception or reality to bolster and justify their own positions and actions? And what does all of this mean for the rest of the international community? I look forward to discussing these and other questions with our panelists this afternoon. So let me just start by asking a question for both of you. How do you see America's current position in the world? Is the United States in decline? And how would you define decline? If the United States is in decline, is it irreversible? So let me start with Dr. Mathews first. Oh, I believe you're muted.
Yes, it's a pleasure to be with you. Yes, I think the answer has to be yes. I'm defining it not in terms of raw power, but in terms of capacity to lead, which has an element of raw power and of economic strength, but also has a very large component of how the rest of the world sees us and how we perform. And by that measure, starting long before Trump, I think one would have to say that the US is in decline. When the rest of the world looks at us, they don't see confident leadership, clear leadership. They see the 2003 invasion of Iraq. They see the subsequent destabilization of the Middle East. And they see a lot of obviously false arguments that went into that invasion, like that we were going to bring democracy to the Middle East. They see the 2008 financial crisis, which destabilized most of the world economically. So those are the big ones, but they also see a pretty incoherent policy in Syria and some ill-judged humanitarian interventions. And they see, and this is something that very few people recognize, that the United States Senate has basically gone out of the business of ratifying multilateral treaties for the last quarter century, 25 years, just a single, a rather minor treaty that it has managed to ratify, with the result that the world can't negotiate treaties in which it's important for the US to be a member because they know we can't ratify it, as for example with climate, and there is a clear loss of commitment for a country that thinks of itself as a leader, and which for most of the post-war era was the leader. And then you would have to also add into the ledger that for the first year plus of the pandemic, the United States handled it worse than any other country, with the world's strongest medical and scientific establishment behind it. By the beginning of this summer, we were 25% of the world's cases and 19% of the deaths for a country that is 4% of the world's population. So I could go on and talk about the additions to that sorry record that President Trump brought. But let me stop here and say that in this crucial element of the capacity to lead, the world holds you, the trust in which it can put, yes, I would say the US is clearly in decline.
Do you think that it's irreversible? Do you think that there's still the potential to change?
But I don't think, and we'll go into, given the situation of our domestic politics, I don't think it can be reversed quickly, but it is certainly not irreversible.
All right, thank you. And Professor Kennedy, the same question is America in decline?
All right. Yes, yes, and yes, with reservations, of course, in all three. So yes, in regard to the military commitments it has to try to sustain across the globe and the military resources it possesses. Its capacities there are significantly less than they were, saying back in the age of JFK. So yes, in the military overstretched realm. Yes, in the economic, technological shares of world power and shares of world high-tech capacities, which I worry about a great deal. I'd like us also to talk about. And yes, also in the areas that Jessica has talked about, which is the relationships to our alliances and relationships to the extraordinary international organization network, which we set up and led with such confidence for many years. So in those three areas, the military, the economic, technological, and the diplomatic alliance and international relationships, I think we have slid. If you are saying, is it reversible? I certainly think I understand what Jessica is saying about the nature of the Senate reluctance to do anything, the internal fissures which make unified policy in diplomatic leadership and commitment so difficult. It's not impossible. I wake up some mornings thinking of an age when the US Senate leaders came over to FDR's White House to talk through and listen to what is going on. Maybe that's a dream, but in that element, there's surely political leadership could turn a lot of things around. In terms of the economic and technological decline in our share and our capacities, I rather doubt it. We may lead in certain areas, but I think we have lost the lead in the production of microchips and certain other high-tech economic productive capacities. Hard to reverse that. And in the military realm, well, that depends on whether we can have a good look at the relationship between our military capacities and our military obligations and try to prioritize there. If we could, we might be able to sustain ourselves in the world a lot better than we have done.
All right, thank you. So, what you both said basically is that yes, we are in decline, particularly in the economic tech sector, but there's still some hope that maybe we can reverse it. So, my next question then for you, Dr. Mathews, what are America's greatest domestic challenges, and what should its policy priorities be?
Well, this one is really easy to answer. Our biggest challenge is that the foundations of our democracy are in jeopardy, and it's almost, you have to almost kind of catch yourself when you say those words, because 3 years ago would have been inconceivable to say that our ability to run an election that all of our people trust, our ability to have a peaceful transition of power, our capacity of our population to at least know enough facts and about our status and about the world to have semi-intelligent opinions. All of that would have been, of course, we had all of those things. And now we are in, I think, imminent jeopardy of losing the ability to carry out a fair and trusted election, and one where who gets to vote and in what jurisdictions actually reflects our population is in jeopardy. And once that's gone, you can't run a democracy.
So do you have some ideas about how that could be, addressed?
Well, some of them are more hopes that Donald Trump gets taken away, gets seen as illegitimate through court actions or the like, or his own behavior. More long-term, I think we have to get rid of the Electoral College, which is doable because it's not in the Constitution. And it is less difficult than it seems until you actually look at it. States holding the majority of the country's population to say that they only cast their votes for whomever has the majority of the votes in their state. It's doable. Whether it will happen in anytime soon is a different question. And there are other proposals that are being considered, like universal voting, the way Australia, for example, has it, where everybody has to vote, even if you vote no choice. The ways to, and then if Congress can pass the voting reform bills that would prevent a complete breakdown of the system in 24. So there are answers. They don't look terribly hopeful right now. Everything that we worried about last January has gotten worse, not better. So, but I think I guess what I really want to say is that nobody should underestimate the degree of jeopardy that the way of political life that we take absolutely for granted, in how deep danger it is.
Thank you.
So, nothing else comes close in terms of priorities.
Right. Oh, thank you very much for that answer. Now, if I can switch to you, Professor Kennedy, and follow up on something that you discussed very briefly. Has the U.S. reached the point where it has overextended its capabilities and commitments like other great powers in the past, such as Great Britain? But what are some of the opportunities that the United States can seize, given these challenges that it has externally?
Look, the fact that we, political commentators, strategic studies people, and historians like myself say this looks like some of the great powers overstretch of the past, it's eerily reminiscent of the time, say, when Great Britain a century ago, and around 1900, was still the #1 naval power by far, had by far the largest set of overseas bases, cable communications network that nobody else had. But at that time, it was facing a crisis in the maybe breakdown of China. It was looking at Russian advances across Central Asia towards India. It had a near war with France in the Nile and West Africa. It was trying to keep its eye on the ambitions of Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany. And when you put together all of the challenges across different parts of the globe, and even though it was #1, it's overstretched. So that, I think, is what is going on here. We are maybe close to the possibility that this Christmas, two rather malignant leaderships in Moscow and Beijing may be talking with each other, will each decide to put pressure in two very different parts of the globe. And you know what I'm talking about. On the Ukraine borders, perhaps creating an internal incident there, nice present for us on Boxing Day, and ever more overflight of a Chinese aircraft across Taiwan. If one of those accidentally gets shot down, we have an immediate Taiwan crisis and a possibility of an immediate Ukraine crisis, with another malevolent leadership like Iran doing something to upset us, say, in the Persian Gulf. And if we look at the list of our sort of military assets, we can see that where do we put our eggs? How many of our surface forces do we put in the Far East as opposed to in the Eastern Mediterranean or in the Baltic? That's the way the military count. And from their viewpoint, it's quite clear they feel overstretched.
Mm-hmm. So what should the United States do, especially seeing this partnership between Beijing right now and Moscow? What, how could the United States offset that partnership?
Well, I think that first we should use the strongest language that diplomacy can allow. And I'm glad President Biden had that conversation with Putin a couple of days ago. And I think there should be increasingly firm and strong languages to those three potential upsetters of our place in the world, that is Iran, Russia, and China, that if they go too far, they could be responsible for destabilizing things and producing a stronger reaction. But say no more than that. And don't talk about we're not going to do this or we're not going to do that, because that gives the game away. Secondly, really have a serious look through the National Security Council, surely, at the deployments of where we have. I know President Biden justifiably has spent this first year looking at the economy and COVID. But there has to be a time where he and the vice president and the senior ministers look and go off for a weekend and just look at the dispositions of our forces across the globe, and then look at the list of obligations we have, and then thirdly, look at the list of alliances, the plus side of American diplomacy, which we can bring in. We need a global look sometime and sometime soon.
Thank you. Dr. Mathews, is there anything you would like to add to
Yeah,
that?
I have somewhat different view about our military strength. It's true that China is now, after many, many years of spending very little on the military, is spending a lot and is catching up both quantitatively and qualitatively, in particular with the hypersonic missiles. But I think that I think I would say that in terms of raw military power, this is one area where we're not in decline. We are spending roughly $800 billion a year on defense, which is more than the next 8 powers, including Russia and China, combined spend. We spend it poorly. We waste probably, I mean, military people estimate numbers as high as maybe even a third of it is poorly spent. And we are too devoted to legacy systems, to old World War II systems that proved themselves long ago, and spend too little on the new digitally managed systems, small weapons that can attack in swarms and that use artificial intelligence and are quite a different thing than an aircraft carrier, which is vulnerable to a tiny little missile. So this is an area where we need to do better and need to recognize how much we pour into spending in this area. But I wouldn't say we're in decline. Where I would agree is the connection between weaponry and military power and military capacity, which in terms of training and logistics and management, which ours is superb, that and our greatest asset, which is the breadth and depth historically of our international relationships, friendships, principally in Europe, but also increasingly in Asia. And there, I totally agree with Paul. It is the revitalization of those relationships that will, and that can come, I think that is probably easier to fix than our domestic politics, our domestic polarization. But the biggest mistake that hurts us enormously now of recent years was Trump's throwing away of the Iran nuclear deal when the Iranians were totally in compliance with it. That so undermines people's trust in our capacity to make agreements and then to keep them, that it's going to be a long time before it's forgotten. And in fact, it may be a very long time before the problem of the Iranian nuclear weapon is dealt with one way or another, and it could be a terrible outcome. So I think it's to understand the nature of the decline, which is partly a natural growth and rebirth of others. It's nuanced, and to me, the core of it is our dysfunction at home. There are just too many issues, starting with the pandemic, right, that have no business being a partisan issue, that are partisan and that so distort our ability to make sensible policy that we are really crippled by it.
Thank you. So given, as you mentioned, the technological advances and America's not adjusting militarily to these advances, as well as different powers asserting themselves more than in the past, perhaps, because maybe they do perceive America's strength is declining, so they feel more emboldened. How will this affect the rest of the international community? I think that is one of the major questions. How do other countries react to these great powers, all shifting alliances and having different priorities? How will that impact? So if I could start with you, Professor Kennedy.
So look, allow me to put a basic statistic on the table, which I do often to my Yale undergraduates to think about. And I'm glad Jessica brought it up in a bleak way when she said, we have only 4% of the world's population. So I put a screen chart of just 3 pie charts showing that right about now, the US has approximately 40% of world's total defense spending. It is enormous at 800 billion and some extra on the side for operations. 40% of defense spending, depending on the way you count it, and some economists want to do it one way and the other, we may have something like 19% of world GDP or 21% of world GDP, but it's about half of the defense spending share in the world. And then we have 4% of the world's population. So to me, it's quite staggering to think that this single nation with its 4% and it's being one of the 200 members of the United Nations has about 1/5 of the world's economic heft and about, what would you say, 40% of the world's military heft. But over time, probably as other countries rise, our share of world economic production will start to go further down relatively. And therefore, it's likely that we actually have to keep spending more and more, or we reduce our defense share of spending share, that is, of total defense spending. So in a relative term, we have a big struggle. And therefore, and I think Jessica come back again and again to nifty principled leadership, working with like-minded countries and allies to help out this enormous big juggling act. This is where I think getting a nice message and a reassuring message to our allies is significant. And if we can do it really at the time when we look so fractured and disconnected and discombobulated from the outside, that is a really big challenge.
Thank you. And Dr. Mathews?
I think we lost Dr. Mathews, so hopefully she'll be able to get back on.
Okay, all right. This would be my last question before we move on to the Q&A box and get questions from our participants. Professor Kennedy, since the Cold War ended, the United States has been searching for a guiding principle or ideological driver to help shape foreign policy. Given America's domestic challenges and political division, is fresh thinking even possible to develop a new effective approach to foreign policy?
I'm skeptical about any single slogan that should be defining our place in the world and the message that we send out in the world. I think, first of all, we should really be thinking of getting ourselves in better shape at home, the big difficulty, as Jessica said, before we can preach to the world. I think a policy of saying we are going to support our allies and like-minded countries, we should beat that drumbeat all the time. I'm really glad that President Biden is going to lead this conference with the democratic nations and asserting democracy. It is something that terrifies these regimes which are trying to upset us. And so we should be more confident of the democratic message and reach out to those who are like-minded with us, with Australia, with Japan, with the European countries, some of the African countries too, our Latin American friends. We have a lot to do on the diplomatic front, but a steady message of reassurance and that we have certain principles we are going to uphold needs to be said again and again and again. There's nothing wrong with doing that so long as we are not boastful about it, and so long as we realize that we have to do a bit of give and take with allies who would love to work with us, provided we are not singly one-sided in our policies and upsetting allies by not consulting them in advance.
Thank you so much. Now I will turn to the Q&A and look at some questions for you. Here's one question. Is the question really about decline of the US, or is it a question of how to balance geopolitical security without huge losses?
So it is about geopolitical decline. If we can define what that is, and it is to say that we're trying to carry out a world role, a world geopolitical role, which is a legacy of the enormous advantageous position the United States had at the end of the Second World War, being victorious in Europe and across the Mediterranean with a big fleet in there shortly after the war, being dominant in the Pacific and Far East, building up a set of alliance relationships as the Soviet Union looked so hostile. And at that time, we had a fair, if you look at it, I would say the relationship between our means and our ends. The capacities we had and the firm alliances we had, that's our means, and the ends, which is the obligations we had to our allies in Europe and in the Far East, were pretty closely matched together. So we had a kind of geopolitical strategic sort of balance, which allowed us to regard ourselves rightly as a number one in the world. Right now, we still are occupying almost all of those positions, the post-Second World War positions, but our relationships with some of our friends have withered, and our capacities surely have gone down relative to, say, the age of Eisenhower.
Thank you so much. I don't know, Dr. Mathews, if you heard the question, but I can repeat it for you.
If you would.
Yes, the question is really about decline of the United States. Is that the question, or is it a question of how to balance geopolitical security without huge losses?
Well, I think I would phrase it somewhat differently, which is it is a failure to have adjusted to changes in the world that are natural, and some of them, after all, are changes we ourselves worked to make, like the economic recovery of the rest of the world after World War II. This was our goal, was to develop markets for our products and to restore the economic. So some of that is not bad in the sense of they were things we worked to achieve. What I think we haven't done is that we are still behaving as though we were the hegemon, the global hegemon that we were in the 3-4 decades after World War II, that we no longer are. And we no longer are that, not because we're weaker, but because others are stronger. So, and then that problem is compounded by the problem that we have lost any sense of coherence and political capacity at home. And so when you put those two things together, you have a very ugly picture. And that's how I see it. It means that that we have to adjust our own expectations of foreign policy and our own ambitions, as Paul has said, to better reflect the world in which we're now living, rather than the world that we are so familiar with of either the immediate post-war era or the Cold War, when countries had to choose between us and the Soviet Union. And as time went on, it was a particularly easier and easier choice. But they were followers because they had to pick sides. Now we need followers and allies that choose to, especially in East Asia. And that's a completely different, and that does require a degree of trust and also of agreement with aims. If I can take one other second, I mean, there are people now urging that we try to assemble a coalition in East Asia to work with us to have a war with China over Taiwan. Most of the countries in East Asia, with maybe one or two exceptions, the core principle of their foreign policy is not to have to choose between the United States and China. So, and certainly don't share the sense that the most likely outcome of the Taiwanese situation should be a hot war. And so this is old think, very old think, in a new world.
And actually, I wanted to give you the opportunity, following up on this, about the new way of thinking versus the old. Since the Cold War ended, the United States has been searching for a guiding principle or ideological driver. And given all America's domestic challenges and political divisions, do you think fresh thinking toward foreign policy is possible?
Certainly thinking is possible. And there are scholars, academics, and think tank people who are trying to grope towards a different kind of core strategy. But fresh thinking is always the hardest thing of anything to do. It's much easier to sort of tinker with what you're familiar with. And I don't think we're there yet. And one hint is, we're still calling this era the post-Cold War era. We don't have a name for it yet. And that suggests, right, that we don't have a way to think about it yet. And so we're early, I think, in the search for a new guiding principle, a new strategy. We can move a little, I think we can move much more quickly to adjust tactics, and that will help move us in that direction.
Thank you so much.
For example, we've gotten used to, I think, over-relying on sanctions, especially over-relying on unilateral sanctions. And this is one we could and should, I think, abandon quickly. We have an idea that it is a reward to talk to us, when in fact, that's backwards. I mean, it is countries you really don't like, you really don't have agreement with, like Iran, that you need to talk to. So now we have this crazy situation where on a core issue of enormous importance to us, we're not in the room. The Iranians talk to the Europeans, and then the Europeans come outside and talk to us in the hallway, because we think that we shouldn't reward Iran with being recognized by us. This is self-defeating in the extreme.
Thank you so much. And now I have a question. We've been examining the perception from outside, looking at the United States and some of our own domestic issues. But this question, it's for both of you. Do both of you have a strong sense of how much the American people care about the country's relative decline? Do you think most American citizens are preoccupied with domestic, economic, and cultural conditions and not really paying attention to foreign policy? So if I could start with you, Professor Kennedy.
Yes, and I want to give an anecdote or two here just to carry out the thought I have in my mind. When 30 years ago, my book Rise and Fall of Great Powers came out and was in quite considerable discussion, and I ended up on many radio shows where the host would open up for Q&A after I talked a bit about the thesis of the Rise and Fall of Great Powers, and the host would mention our decline. And it was instructive and interesting to me, and I'm sure Jessica has had the same experience. Different people had different notions about the decline thing. Some of them were terribly upset about cultural change and erosion of what they saw as a previous, more harmonious sort of Norman Rockwell America. Maybe that was a fantasy in their words, but it had declined, and there were all sorts of things going on. And the unrest at the time of the Vietnam War was one sign, and Nixon's dubiousness was another sign. And people would ask me questions which were, in some cases, kind of absurd. Like, do you think the Jesuits are behind all of our decline? or like, don't you think there's too many homosexuals taking over? And the host had to really slap down the questioner and move on to somebody who was so really interested in whether we had enough submarines or aircraft carriers. So I found over time that when you hit the D word, the decline word, you have then to try to understand what the person you're talking to or asking questions of really has in mind when they're talking about decline. Is it cultural? Is it economic? Is it the state of American schools? Is it the erosion of our relationships? It could be any one of those which are on their minds.
Thank you. And Dr. Mathews?
Well, I mean, I have to completely agree with that, but now it has become, I mean, in a way, it is reassuring to hear that somebody was worrying about a conspiracy theory of the Jesuits 30 years ago, because our conspiracy culture has become so deep and so exaggerated. I do think it will be necessary for Congress to legislate, to control, reform the social media platforms, which are so much a part of the dysfunction in our society. And that should be a relatively easy thing to say, right? And yet, when you look back at when was the last time Congress really grappled with a new problem and came up with important new legislation, it's a long time ago. A long time ago. But I mean, Americans hate the word decline. They need to think of us as the greatest country in the world. And this notion of American exceptionalism, you know, goes back all the way to our founding, to the Revolutionary period, and although it has changed over the years, but it has been an integral part of America's thinking about the world. And so adjusting, people's need to adjust how they think about us relative to others is going to be, I think, a slow and difficult kind of evolution. But it has to come because the world has changed. The world has changed.
Yes, yes, thank you so much. Now we have another question. How can we reassure our allies or our adversaries of our good intentions when our political system allows us to drastically change international policy every 4 years? You know, for example, Iran has indicated that it does not want another nuclear agreement with the US unless we can guarantee that it will go on beyond the Biden presidency. So if I could start with you, actually, Dr. Mathews.
Well, this is one reason why I emphasize the importance of the Senate being able to ratify treaties, because even though executive agreements have the same legal standing, they are easy to throw away, as we saw Trump do with the Iran nuclear deal, whereas a treaty is not. But the fact that we have a Senate now that for 25 years has been unable to ratify a multilateral treaty is a real problem. And this includes treaties that were directly American ideas. or copies of American domestic legislation that the Senate rejected. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty was an American project that we worked on for years, and the Senate was unable to ratify. And there are many, many examples. So you can't rewind the movie, right? We can't undo the fact that the US did what it did with the Iran deal. That's there, and it's going to be in everybody's memory for a very long time, and we can't fix it because as you said, and as the president has made clear, there's no way to
Oops. I think Dr. Mathews is frozen. So Professor Kennedy, would you like to comment on that question?
process.
Oh, she's
Look.
back.
Huh? Oh, I'm sorry.
Did you, I turned it over to, but please finish your thought. I have your back.
I'm not sure when I got lost. So, but it is impossible to, this is why the trust is a core part of an effective foreign policy. And for a country like ours, where one of our key assets, as Paul has said, is the breadth and scope and depth of our international friendships and alliances, that trust is a huge part of, it has to be, of shaping and succeeding in any foreign policy. And the only way we can regain that trust is by acting trustworthy and over a long period of time to wipe out what we've done before. By the way, just to say it, this is why I don't think that, or this and earlier discussion about that I don't think that the end of the war in Afghanistan is a big problem for us. The execution was horrible over a few weeks. I think largely because of Ashraf Ghani more than us, at least the rapid takeover of the Taliban. But the people who say this proves that the US has no strategic patience, or this proves that the US doesn't keep its word, is nonsense. We kept it for 20 years. We tried, and we finally recognized that we were trying to do something, a changing thing that we couldn't achieve. Whereas the Iran deal is a completely different example of how you lose international trust, and then you have to earn it back.
Thank you so much. So Professor Kennedy, how can we make our allies, our adversaries, see us as being reliable partners beyond one presidential administration?
Look, I'm rather cheerier here, even though we've had 4 years of what I regard as a very dreadful presidency. Nonetheless, we have a 4-year timing clock which allows the American democracy to change again. Let's put it this way. Of course, third parties, countries which we want to negotiate with or have friendships with or alliances with, do get frustrated when there is a change of government, a change of administration every 4 years. But as part of our democratic system, it happens, as you've seen just right now, in the Federal Republic of Germany, with a switch in the leadership there. It happened quite significantly in France. It happened very significantly in the United Kingdom when Boris Johnson came in. So that's the nature of the democratic and parliamentary process. It is a measure of strength as well as of, in some cases, uncertain or zigzag policies. I think because we wish to reach out to other countries who have similar sort of parliamentary and democratic systems, that's as far as I'm concerned, a merit and a plus. It's just that we have to recognize that our antagonists here have something of an advantage in the long-term sustainability, if you like, of their autocratic leaderships. Russia hasn't changed for quite a number of years. But China hasn't changed for quite a number of years. This gives the leadership of those countries quite a significant, like, diplomatic advantage. Wasn't it one of the more disturbing, I would say, photographs of the week, that of Putin in New Delhi shaking hands with Modi? Both of them are trying to play a game of saying, we can operate independently of the United States. I can buy weapons from Russia. And we look as if we're sidelined because of that. Our diplomacy, including the Senate's support of our diplomacy, Jessica is just right here, the Senate's support of our invigorating ambassadors in different parts of the world, is something that is part of our agenda. It's not the end of the world that we switch every 4 years, but it is something that has to be taken into account. That's for sure.
Thank you. Thank you so much. There are some questions regarding the New World Order. What dynamic is creating the New World Order? And one person asked about populism. Is populism the new trend? Could you make a few very brief comments about that? Can I start with you, Dr. Mathews?
Yes. I mean, it is everywhere. And whether that is for similar reasons, I don't know, but it's striking how international this trend is. It may be that just the pace of change in the world was so rapid for so many decades, and governments had a hard time dealing with it, accommodating it, buffering between that global change and their own populations, that people lost confidence in, particularly in democratic governments, and then and turned to populist autocrats.
Professor Kennedy?
I agree with Jessica. In other words, what I'm saying is that there are serious military technological overstretches. There is a concern about our high tech and our economic relative capacities. But this other element you point on, and this is our final area, this other element of declining belief in democracy and the capacity of democracies to get things done, a lack of faith in governments and in public servants, is something that is going to be very, very difficult to turn around. The changes were too fast for too many societies. And I think we ought to understand that and try to help them.
Thank you. And there's another very interesting question about, is this America's perestroika moment? How Gorbachev tried to obviously initiate perestroika, and ultimately, we saw the end of the Soviet Union. So is the United States facing this type of situation now itself, a cultural realignment, different priorities for the country? So if I can start with you, actually, Professor Kennedy.
I'm not sure of the comparison with the pretty noble efforts of Gorbachev to reform a failed ideological and political and economic system in the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is analogous to us. If it's meant to, is this the chance for us to do some sort of transformative political and internal changes which will reinvigorate our society and send out a message of hope to other societies looking at us? Well, yes, maybe, but I would cast aside using terms like perestroika, which don't really fit our case at present.
Thank you. And Dr. Mathews?
I mean, I agree with that. The only little connection I can see is that there does seem to be a crystallizing of a culture war that is more broad-based than I think we've ever had it before. I mean, the fact that people will put their lives in jeopardy, their lives, for either a set of weird conspiracy things or misinformation, or simply that because they don't want to be told by government what to do to get vaccinated, it tells you a lot about how deep this is and how difficult it's going to be to root it out.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, thank you very much. And if I might, in the few minutes that we have remaining, I wanted to try to end up on a more positive note, if possible. As final wrap-up question, what do you believe is America's strongest asset that could help lead the country through its current difficulties? So if I can start with you, Professor Kennedy.
Oh, we have such a variety of assets. My mind is going through those positive ones that you ask for. But I do think in terms of a cultural message of openness, of a training of a new generation of people who will go out into the world and interact in other societies, if we can allow them to do so, if COVID will allow them to do so. The resources of civilization, Mr. Gladstone said when he had a great problem on Ireland, the resources of civilization are not yet exhausted. I think the resources of our civilization and our political leadership are not exhausted, even though they depress Jessica and myself a great deal. So I do think something of a steadfast message at the top from our political leadership would be something I would welcome to the greatest degree, because if that happens, consistency between president and the Congress over time, then a whole lot of things which we see as issues in like decaying military hardware can surely be solved. The other one, leadership and national trust, is a far more difficult, precarious, but absolutely essential thing to turn to. And I think, really, I do think we have the capacity to do it if you want to be positive.
Right, thank you so much. And Dr. Mathews?
We have a very long history of problem solving, of solving our problems, of overcoming. And that's there in all of our collective memories. What I'm sorry to say something negative in a positive answer, but what has changed is that we now are turning political disagreements into personal, into personality, into hatred. And that stifles what has been a country of can-doers, of we can solve this, we can work together, we can deal with this with neighbors and community leaders and friends who maybe we don't agree with on big national issues, but we'll do this. So while I would single out that history of solving problems successfully as a huge asset that's there, if we can dig back to it, it is now covered by this horrible new thing of extending political or ideological differences into personal relationships that makes it impossible to come back to that. But there it is still in the past.
Well, thank you so much. This has been a fascinating discussion, and I'm sorry we couldn't get to all the questions. There were numerous, but I realized this was a very ambitious topic, and really each question could have its own webinar. So I so appreciate your concise answers and all the information that you shared with us today. And I will now turn it over to Courtney.
Well, thank you both. Thank you, Joanna, so much for leading this discussion. Dr. Mathews, Professor Kennedy, thank you so much. It was a thoughtful, sobering conversation and one well worth having. So it really was an honor to have both of you with us today. And thank you to everyone who joined. There were really fantastic questions in the Q&A box. I'm sorry we could not get to all of them. My quick plea before you run away, we do have an event coming up on Monday on the Taliban and the future of women's rights in Afghanistan. So please do RSVP for that. It should be a fascinating discussion. And we are trying to keep these briefings free and open to all. And to do that, we need support. It's our end of the year plea. We're trying to reach 2020 donors, and we would love your help in reaching that goal. And thank you to everyone who has already donated. It makes a difference. So thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Professor Kennedy. Thank you, Dr. Mathews. This was fantastic.
Merry Christmas.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Same. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jessica. Merry Christmas.